Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Boris Johnson, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has won the contest to become the next Prime Minister of Britain. He enters 10 Downing Street at a tough time for his country. At the moment, UK faces two major crises. One with Iran over the Middle East country's seizure of a British flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, and second, an internal struggle the country has been besieged by for the past 3 years, which is Brexit. So we will be discussing today how the Eton and Oxford University grad, the former Mayor of London and former Foreign Minister from 2016 to 2018 will handle UK and its set of challenges. So let me introduce our guests who are joining us today. We have Mr. Alex de Ruyter. He's the Director for the Centre for Brexit Studies in London. And also we have with us Mr. Leo Nicholas Barnes, a Senior Editor at Foreign Policy Press in London. Welcome to both of you to the show. I want to start with you, Mr. Alex. We've spoken about this on Newswire so many times about the Brexit situation. How do you, first of all, see him becoming Prime Minister and in terms of his Brexit strategy going forward?
Well, we here at the Centre for Brexit Studies at Birmingham City University have been looking at this issue for a while, of course, and with Boris Johnson now as Prime Minister stepping into the role, well, his professed Brexit strategy is to have the UK leave the EU on October the 31st, come what may. Now, that might have worked very well as a campaign slogan with 150,000 odd Tory party members, but I'm not quite sure it holds traction for the country at large. I mean, only 25% of the population, according to poll estimates, support leaving the European Union with no withdrawal agreement, so-called no deal. So he faces a huge obstacle there. And of course, that's reflected in the makeup of this current parliament, where the government's majority is only 3, and it relies on the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland to keep it in office, so to speak. So he faces all the same constraints that Theresa May did, but according to him, he's going to address these challenges with positive thinking and brio and verve. So how that collides with reality remains to be seen, I'm afraid.
Now, he is also facing, of course, on his Brexit strategy, a lot of criticism. Mr. Leo just yesterday, in fact, revealed that the junior Foreign Minister, Alain Duncan, was trying to force a vote on Johnson's leadership, which was consequently then blocked by Common Speaker Johnson Bercow. Can you shed some insight into why this move was being made?
Indeed, and there were some conflicting reports about why he might choose to do this. Sir Ian said himself that it was a positive move and he was trying to help Mr. Johnson and establish some support within the party so it might protect him from any future no-confidence votes. But in reality, people are seeing it as Sir Ian trying to undermine Mr. Johnson's administration before it even gets up and running. Because as our previous guest mentioned, the majority is very narrow. It's only 3, and the DUP, their confidence and supply partners, will not support any Brexit action unless there is a change to the backstop, which does not look like it is going to occur. So overall, it was an attempt to try and stifle Mr. Johnson. It was blocked by, as you say, Mr. Bercow, but that certainly won't be the last time that there is an attempt to either rebuff or even take down this Johnson administration.
Right. So, OK, let's backtrack a little. Mr. Alain, I'd like to get your opinion on this. Him being voted in by 160,000 members of the Conservative Party. In itself, do you think Boris Johnson is the true representation of the people of Britain?
Well, if we take the polls as a guide, now the best thing we have, that the last YouGov poll conducted around the 16th of July suggested the Conservative Party would be on about 25% support. And another poll relating to Boris Johnson's expected performance, over half the respondents thought he would be bad for the country. So, no, I don't think he is representative of the wider UK populace at all, I'm afraid.
And this poses then the question that in terms of the foreign policy challenges, Mr. Leo, what could possibly he facing in terms of challenges, especially since President Trump of the US has been a big supporter of Johnson. So besides them both setting maybe a new hairstyles trend, what do you think they will do in terms of Iran?
Yeah, it's. I think the Iran question is going to be the most immediate issue that they face over the coming weeks, and it will be tricky, especially because even though Mr. Johnson perceives himself to be rather eloquent as a diplomat, he was famously described as incompetent and even an embarrassment by the staff who worked under him whilst he was the foreign secretary. And so when you put this in play with Mr. Trump's, let's say, brash style of international relations, we really have no idea how this could turn out. The Iranians are already saying that Britain's seizure of the Iranian oil tanker off Gibraltar was in effect trying to do America's bidding. So there is already that kind of polarity set between them. But how Mr. Johnson will try and go ahead with this is really anyone's best guess. If he tries to appease Trump and try and escalate tensions further, or whether he will go for a more diplomatic route, try and release both tankers so they can come to some kind of diplomatic acquiescence, is really anyone's best guess.
Now, Mr. Leo, there's a lot of analysts and critics saying that essentially the UK has been sort of trapped in to this mess with Iran by President Trump's B team, essentially Mr. Bolton. How do you see this allegation? And do you think if it rings true, what can the UK do to get out of this situation?
Firstly, I don't think it's particularly representative of the entire story. Obviously, Iran and the UK have had almost as an interesting relationship with Iran as the US, going back to 1953. And so even though one could argue that this is part of America's plan of undermining Iran, it was the UK's decision to seize that tanker off the Strait of Gibraltar. And so I think we have to acknowledge our very sort of independent role in this, even if it comes as part of a wider plan. And so with regards to coming out of this, then I would say that the most sensible thing to do for us at the moment is to release the Iranian tanker, given that the legal dispute going on regarding it does not look like it will necessarily go in the UK's favour. And then that will mean that the release of the UK's ship and also our crew, which is also incredibly important.
Right. I mean, essentially, peace and security and stability would be in UK's favour. But here, in this situation, let's not forget that it was Mr. Boris Johnson himself who in 2018 went to the US to try and convince President Trump to not pull out of the JCPOA. And of what has happened in recent events, he's even said earlier before in his campaign that he would never take military action. He opposes military action in Iran. So it almost seems there's a lot of US pressure on him to have, to take the same stance as Trump. Can we expect him to deliver on the same alliance, sort of the same demands that President Trump has?
No, I think that may be one of the redeeming features of this Johnson government, that with regards to foreign policy, I think that the UK still has enough clout that he will be confident enough, that despite how he talks about his European allies, he will be confident enough that he will have the support from Europe to act in a way that is far more diplomatic and will hopefully ease tensions as well. As you say, he was a big fan of JCPOA, which was going to do wonders for relations between Iran, the US, and many of the leading EU states. So there is a good chance that with Mr. Johnson in number 10, that there may not be just two Trumps on the world stage, if you like. There may be, Trump with Mr. Johnson trying his best to appease where he can.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Ms. Leo, for giving your insight here on how Boris Johnson, new Prime Minister of UK, is expected to deliver on foreign challenges. So I'm coming back to you, Mr. Alex, and I want to talk a little more about the Brexit situation. Now, I understand that there is going to be a sort of a summer vacation period for the MPs. And so what happens if after the summer vacation, the MPs are back and they still don't want to continue, they come back and they still find no confidence in Prime Minister Johnson's plan on Brexit?
Well, Parliament, of course, passed an amendment committing the House of Commons to sittings in October and for the government to report on progress in Northern Ireland as a means of trying to prevent Boris Johnson from suspending Parliament, the so-called proroguing option, if you like. There are still precious few sitting days, between then and the 31st of October, about 14, I think. So the default position, of course, is that come 31st of October, government and parliament cannot agree a response to the EU, then the UK will leave the European Union with no agreement. That is the default position. So something has to give. With Boris Johnson's wafer-thin majority, of course, the threat is always there of a no-confidence motion, which may well emerge if he tries to press ahead with no deal in September.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you so much there, Mr. Alex. We are now joined by Mr. Adam Garrie, an analyst joining us from London. Welcome to Newswire. I want to ask you this, what you see in terms of all that is on Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plate, not just talking about how he's going to take up Brexit. He has been campaigning that irrespective of whether EU extends the deadline or not, we are leaving. Brexit is going to take place on October 31st.
Well, those are indeed his policies, but I see it difficult to be realized unless he makes some sort of pact with the Brexit party, the surging party led by Nigel Farage, who met with Donald Trump just yesterday, a day after Imran Khan did, so there's an interesting connection to Pakistan there. I think that when it comes to getting Brexit through by the deadline, he's going to need to call an election before then because the parliament remains deadlocked, and now they're tying his hands further in terms of prorogation. There's still a slim chance he could invoke some fairly obscure legal mechanism to achieve prorogation before the end of October, but it's looking less and less likely. It seems as though the only way that Brexit can actually be achieved is if Boris Johnson or one of his colleagues speaks to Nigel Farage and works out some sort of pact before they go into a new election season.
And also there are a lot of MPs who have been protesting and warning that they won't work with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, considering what his take on Brexit is. Can you tell us a little about what is the reality, what is realistic to expect? Will they resign and who these MPs are?
Well, a lot of them are going to resign. Many of them already have resigned, not from the Conservative Party, but from the cabinet, from the front bench. They don't necessarily want to leave the party yet, and yet is the most important word at this point, but they can't see themselves working with Boris Johnson. And there's two main reasons. The first reason and the main reason is that all of these people that have resigned and that are about to resign are anti-Brexit. They want Britain to either remain fully in the EU or they want some sort of association agreement whereby Britain remains in the EU in all but name. On the other side, there's some who are resigning for personal reasons. Boris Johnson is a very flamboyant personality. He's very outspoken. Some say he's controversial. Some say that he has a sense of humor. There's many interpretations of it, but his personality clearly clashes with some of the more mundane members of his party. And so that's the other reason why a lot of them are about to resign from the cabinet.
Okay, stay with us there, Mr. Adam. Just got Miss Natalie Sarkic, a former British diplomat, European affairs and media expert, joining us right now in Newswire from London. Welcome to the show, Miss Natalie. I would like to ask you this, if you could shed some light on this, considering your experience in this area. Do you feel that the US is threatening to draw Britain into a larger showdown between Tehran and Washington?
Well, I think there's always a risk of that, given the US position. But so far, it seems that the UK position has been to try to keep some distance between the UK's position and that of the US, and in fact, to look to our European allies to form an alliance to help the shipping that needs to go through the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm-hmm. And also, do you have confidence that Prime Minister Boris Johnson is right now in a position to deal with this kind of what potentially could be a impasse or a standoff between him and President Trump, since so far they have considerably toed the line on how President Trump wants to deal with Iran?
Well, I think the main problem is that Boris Johnson is not yet in power as Prime Minister, and he doesn't yet have a foreign secretary, or at least not one that we know of. And I fear that he will be distracted, and therefore the policy towards Iran and indeed the US may not be well thought through, and that's the risk, that there is something that happens without our real kind of good governance and good policy making that you would normally expect from the UK in terms of its foreign affairs.
Right, and this is not the only foreign policy challenge he is going to be facing in the coming sort of the beginning of his term. There's also the question about tech giants, 5G, that earlier on UK has been hesitant to sort of comply with what President Trump has been indicating, that they be given no market in the UK.
Well, I do think that Brexit is just going to dominate everything for the next few weeks and months. And so all of those kind of issues that you mentioned will probably take, second place, or he may delegate them to the members of his cabinet. But Brexit is the big policy issue, and that's the big problem for him.
And then there's also, besides not just the 5G technology thing, there's Iran going on. Are there any other kind of foreign policy challenges that might sort of get ignored a little with the ongoing Brexit saga in the UK?
Oh, it's difficult to say. Foreign policy continues no matter what. And as I'm a former diplomat, I know that our diplomats will be doing a great job and the best job that they can do in the circumstances. But I do think that the international field at the moment is dominated by Donald Trump. And all that comes with that in terms of trade, but also relations with the big powers like Russia and China, and indeed this latest relationship issue with Iran. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a very bumpy time for the UK, because we don't have the EU allies right behind us that we would normally have had as a full member of the EU.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned not just the sort of EU allies, but there's also concern about President Trump's criticism on NATO allies and them not doing enough, not stepping up. And here, Mr. Adam Carey, I'd like your opinion also on this. Is this also going to be a big concern, especially considering, as Ms. Natalie pointed out, with the Brexit going on, a lot of this might just not get the kind of attention it needs at this point?
Well, I personally don't think that the US and Iran are going to go to war. There's probably going to be more sanctions. There could even be some other unfortunate provocations in the Strait of Hormuz or nearby areas, but I just don't see the countries going to war. I think what all the sides should do, including all of the parties to the 2015 JCPOA, should get together and say, look, let's all get together and have a summit, but this time, in order to regionalize the issue, we need to invite Turkey and we need to invite Pakistan, two neighbors of Iran, two very important neighbors of Iran. And I think that was one of the things missing from the 2015 agreement, and that the closest country that was part of the initial JCPOA was Russia, which obviously no longer shares a border with Iran. That itself makes it a bit of a bad process. It would be like having a DPRK peace process in which South Korea was ignored and China was ignored and Russia was ignored. Right now, all of the parties, all of the countries that surround North Korea are being consulted. That's the way to do a proper peace process or a proper dialogue process. So I think that should be the focus, because it's high time, frankly, to admit that the 2015 agreement is dead in the water. Some of the Europeans, the French in particular, have tried to save the JCPOA with their financial instrument that they set up in Paris. But as the Iranians have quite honestly admitted, it simply isn't working. So people have got to ask themselves what will work. I think the answer is a JCPOA 2.0, but Turkey and Pakistan must be at that table.
That's a really interesting perspective there. I'm going to bring this to you, Ms. Natalie. First of all, do you agree with the approach that more people need to be, more those regional players need to be brought onto the table to make this essentially work? And on top of that, I also want you to then reflect on whether it's even possible even if President Trump doesn't back that kind of an approach.
Well, you just made the point I was going to make, because I think without President Trump backing such an approach, again, it's probably destined to fail. And I do think that, contrary to what your early speaker said, that a new EU is going to take a few months to get the new leaders into place. But the new EU will have to come with some new energy and probably a new approach, yes. But they will have to make overtures, as will all the other countries, to try and get the US on board.
Right. And do you think that Mr. Boris Johnson, he has that kind of sort of, there's a lot of personality traits that we can see similar to President Trump. He's boisterous. He seems to say what's on his mind. He's straightforward. But do you think he'll be able to pull this off now, especially considering that there's been an emergency meeting called in Vienna to meet with Iran to discuss how they're going to move forward about this, and also alongside that they want to discuss how they're going to police the Strait of Hormuz, which is something Iran is not very keen on?
Well, let's see how Boris Johnson manages with Donald Trump. On the face of it, yes, there's a potential with a good dynamic to perhaps change a little bit the thinking. But as we've seen from previous leaders who've thought that they have good relations with Donald Trump and then gone in and tried to change his mind on things, it doesn't always go the way that they think. But, let's see. Maybe he can manage something. And also, I think it is worth pointing out that Boris Johnson has said in the past he's not in favour of military action, and he has made a distinction between the UK's position and that of the US. So it's a fine line he's going to have to tread pretty soon. It's a big policy issue, a big foreign policy agenda that's right on his plate as soon as he steps into number 10.
All right, thank you, Ms. Natalie, there us from London. Now, coming quickly to you, Mr. Adam, we're just about running out of time for this part of the show. If you were to give us a roundup analysis of how you see Prime Minister Boris Johnson's first year or the next 6-7 months turning out in light of all these challenges he's going to face, not only just internally in terms of Brexit and how he's going to appeal to the masses, but also internationally.
Well, I think it would be very surprising if there wasn't a general election within 12 months. And there's even an increasingly strong possibility that there'll be a general election in less than 6 months. That being said, I do think that if he plays his cards right, he could indeed remain Prime Minister by winning an election within the next year. If he does that, I think we could see him emerge as a bigger figure in gradual steps. Until the Brexit issue is finally resolved, until Brexit happens, I don't think we're going to see a lot of Boris Johnson on the international stage. I think he'll end up delegating most of those issues to a foreign secretary, which means he'll need a very capable and a very articulate and a very well-read and intelligent foreign secretary. Once Brexit is accomplished, though, I think then one could see Boris Johnson emerging as a figure who is far more visible than his two predecessors in terms of foreign affairs. Unlike Theresa May and, frankly, unlike David Cameron, Boris Johnson is interested in the wider world. Unfortunately, sometimes he offends part of that wider world, but at least he's interested in it. So I think once Brexit is done, and it's still a long ways away in more ways than one, I think at that point we'll see Boris Johnson emerge, and I think he may have one or two surprises up his sleeve.
All right, thank you so much. Adam Garrie there joining us from London. That's all the time we have for this story. We're going to take a quick short break, and when we're back, we've got a lot more updates on what's happening in Iran. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, Iran says it is not seeking confrontation with Britain as both are caught up in a spat over sea tankers, according to Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. Now, he said this along with congratulating the new Prime Minister of the UK on Monday in a tweet, which you should be able to see on your screens now. You can see it right up there, and it says, let me read, Theresa May's government's seizure of Iranian oil at behest of US is piracy, pure and simple. I congratulate my former counterpart on becoming UK Prime Minister. Iran does not seek confrontation, but we have 1,500 miles of Persian Gulf coastline. These are our waters and we will protect them. So we will be discussing in the show today with the various guests on what is at stake here and how the escalations that seems to be just getting worse between US and Iran are not just only affecting those in the region, but especially the UK. So with no further ado, let me just introduce our guests. We have two analysts, one from Tehran, Mr. Mostafa Koshcheshm, and one from London, Mr. Nicolai Due Gundersen. Welcome to both of you to the show. I want to start with you, Mr. Nicolai. How do you take this Twitter message? Is it encouraging in terms of some kind of relaxation or like a friendly hand being extended? Or do you feel that in some way it's also a veiled threat?
I wouldn't go as far as calling it a relaxation yet, but I do see it as a positive first step. What the foreign minister is basically trying to say is, look, the seizure in Gibraltar that was under Theresa May's government. Now there's a new government, and because there's a change in government, we may have a chance to talk. I think it's very interesting that this comment comes days before the Sunday meeting in Vienna of the parties to the nuclear deal. That's very, very important. This is going to be a challenge for Boris Johnson because now we're seeing him. He's always wanted to be prime minister, but perhaps you should be careful what you wish for. Now he is prime minister, and his next challenge is going to be, how do you balance the Iran nuclear deal and the tensions in the Gulf with Donald Trump and needing trade deals post-Brexit? That's going to be very interesting. So I do feel it's encouraging, but I also believe that talking about the Persian Gulf being protected by Iran, there might be some issues over disputed territory, but what we see again is the rhetoric of sovereignty, respect our sovereignty. And I do feel that from the Iranian perspective, the collapse of the nuclear deal has been over Trump's arrogance or angry rhetoric that says that Iran has not complied, that basically pushes them into a corner, and that Iran still wants to save face. So he is balancing, the foreign minister of Iran is balancing saving face with trying to avoid war by reaching out to the new prime minister of the United Kingdom.
So, okay, I hear you there, but at the same time, let me just point out something. It seems like a general consensus is here that that's pretty much the take of not just the UK, but all the other co-signatories of the JCPOA. But here's the problem. Now, when President Trump says, you know, there's a possibility of a sort of a free trade deal with the UK, and Boris Johnson has just become prime minister, and he's already said he opposes military sort of confrontation with Iran on the JCPOA. It puts out the question, really, is the UK, along with other countries, going to be able to take a stand, especially in this meeting in Vienna, for what they believe in?
No, I think that any stand would have to be a united one. That is a problem. On the other hand, it's also, I do feel that the foreign minister of Iran, he is kind of, perhaps not backtracking, but softening a previous stance, which basically was that when the Gibraltar incident happened, there were some within Iran who said that the UK is a puppet of the US.
Okay.
You know, they're basically saying that the UK is just towing the US line. Now, by saying that we are open to talk to the United Kingdom, I do believe that Iran is partially withdrawing that or retracting that a little bit. At the same time, it's hard to argue that you can have the nuclear deal without keeping the US somewhat on board. I do think that a united front would be helpful. So, for example, on Sunday is going to be key. If the United Kingdom can speak to Iran, along with China, France, Germany, and Russia, to talk about how to move forward, it may be possible to do so and to minimize U.S. involvement to an extent. But I do think that at the same time, the United States, it still plays a crucial role. So we still have this problem of, you know, can the UK make this work? Can Boris Johnson make this work? And it will be a test, one of his first major tests as Prime Minister.
Okay. So, Mr. Mostafa, then let me ask you this, what you just said. Is Iran ready, or is indicating that it's ready for some kind of reconciliation?
Well, it depends what reconciliation means. Iran never meant to escalate the situation. We need to remember that Iran has been in full compliance with the nuclear deal undertakings first. And these are the Europeans as well as the Americans that have shown inaction or a hostile approach rather than compliance with their undertakings under the JCPOA. And let us remember that it was the UK that seized the Iranian oil cargo in Gibraltar. And Iran's action came in reciprocal move that has been allowed by international law. As long as a nation is harmed by another nation through illegal moves, this harmed nation is allowed to go for a reciprocal action. And Iran is just doing so. And it has never meant to escalate the situation, because escalating tensions in the region would harm not only Iran and its exports and imports and shipping industries, but also would focus attention of the world to this part of the world rather than focusing attention of the public opinion as well as the world, the states, on the defiance of the EU and US with regard to the JCPOA. What Iran wants is the merits that they promised. This is the first thing that Iran has always requested. But this is the United States that is escalating the situation as well as the UK.
And that is an opinion that is being held across the board in majority, if I may say so. But my question is something that you said. It depends on what reconciliation means. Well, if reconciliation meant that the exchange, the release of the UK tanker in exchange of its own in favor of these talks that are about to be held on Sunday in Vienna over the JCPOA and Iran. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, the British had a very good chance to de-escalate the situation last Thursday when the Gibraltar court was about to issue a final court ruling over the case of the Iranian oil cargo. Unfortunately, it extended the detention for about a month, and they escalated the situation because a day later, Iran embarked on seizing the, a law-breaking British tanker in the Persian Gulf. The situation is as such. The UK should prove that it is for de-escalation because they cannot, protect all their ships in this part of the region and in the whole world. They are going to pay lots of costs with regard to high prices of crude as well as shipping and insurance that's going high for the British and other states across the globe, all because the UK complied with the US request to seize the ship. Right. Now, the point here is that Boris Johnson, though little help could be pinned on him, still could prove a very good politician if he opts for the right decision.
Okay, but Mr. Mostafa, hold that thought now. Very quickly, I want to get to you on this. I want you to sort of respond to what Mr. Mostafa has just said. Do you think that the UK had missed an opportunity last week and it sort of exposed them on how sort of their Navy, their Marines are not really in a position to be able to protect all the ships going through the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I think perhaps that's one point that the Foreign Minister of Iran made in his tweet when he said that Iran has the Persian Gulf. I think what he was trying to say is exactly that the Persian Gulf, it may not be completely under Iranian control or ownership, but it is international waters, and the Brits don't monopolize that. Now, the problem is that Foreign Secretary Hunt of the UK has turned around and said, look, if Iran ups the ante, if they continue on this path, we will see a military presence in the Persian Gulf. And I think that, again, that kind of rhetoric is not helpful because now we are seeing increased tension and it's becoming a problem. Right now, we need to see a lowering of tension. I do believe that it is, in this case, countries like the US, countries like, in this case, the UK, should reach out to Iran more diplomatically and recognize that here Iran does feel pushed into a corner. They're trying to save face. And I think that is the point they're trying to make. It also links into the idea that the West is the policeman of the Gulf. This is something that Trump also was complaining about earlier, that he said, we're withdrawing from the Middle East because we're tired of being the policeman of the Gulf. This very patronizing attitude is one that I think is quite insulting, not just to Iran, but to the Middle East in general.
Okay. It's generally offensive, what President Trump says. And I want to welcome Christian Kaunert, a U.S. security expert joining us from Germany. Welcome to Newswire. We're right in the middle of a debate of whether the UK and Iran are ready for some kind of a reconciliation process and what is coming in the way. And it seems the consensus is President Trump's very arrogant approach to Iran, which is so far, it seems, backfired. So just recently, I believe on Monday, in a meeting with Prime Minister Imran Khan, President Trump said he's ready for the absolute worst from Iran. When he says that, what can that be and what can we expect?
I think we need to take President Trump's words quite seriously because if you look at his history on Iran, we can quite clearly see that he's intending at an escalation with Iran. He's been threatening Iran because of nuclear proliferation. He's reversed essentially the policy of his predecessor, President Obama. So we can suspect that he means what he says in this particular instance, which means that this particular situation could get out of control. Iran needs to be very, very careful. I think President Trump is not completely disinterested in ratcheting this entire conflict up further.
Right. So there's also a lot going on in terms of propaganda, and that poses a real threat. It's not spared here in this situation with US-Iran, and now we're hearing reports that a US general appears to be ramping up this sort of military propaganda against Iran, claiming that US forces may have brought down another Iranian drone. And let's not forget, they've yet to show evidence of the first one.
Yes, I mean, this is, of course, we don't know whether this is indeed the case or not, but it shows the certain approach that President Trump has taken on Iran. It's very much in terms of escalating the situation for now, making sure that Iran believes that he's ready to go for a conflict. And I think he means what he says, so there is indeed a possibility that this could happen. Now, will it definitely happen? Well, that we don't know, because, of course, President Trump could still moderate his issues if Iran gives him something, that he can go away and say, well, look at me, I've achieved something here. And in that case, things could de-escalate. But if things go wrong, if the Iranians continue to go down the path that they have been over the last couple of weeks, there's a very strong chance that things could get out of control over the next couple of months.
So, Mr. Christian, there's also this concern of President Trump making a lot of his moves in light of the campaigning that is going on for 2020. Even his opposition has come out and said that we are afraid that he might just win this again. And in that case, it puts this entire situation even on more urgency, because if President Trump is not going to back off and continue to make the situation more tense, what possible ways out are there in this situation?
To be honest, I think hoping that the US will de-escalate that situation, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Because that attempt itself by the US to de-escalate would be a big win in terms of his election campaign.
Oh, certainly. But in a sense, this conflict is going to be a big win for him either way, because if he gets something, because the Iranians back down to an extent, he has a win. But if it continues to escalate, he can also go back to his electorate and say, well, look at me, I've always told you that Iran is a threat and that Iran is dangerous, and now you see what they're doing. So either way,
I would argue, though, with you here, Mr. Christian, that considering that if Iran doesn't back down, and how is that still a win, considering even now they have been and showing proof that they are going beyond the allowed limit of uranium enrichment. And if this is going to continue, they've essentially gone ahead and done exactly what the JCPOA and Obama administration was aiming to stop nuclear proliferation in the region.
Yes, President Trump is always going to back to his prime issue, which is about nuclear proliferation and the nuclear bomb that Iran is aspiring to have, or that is alleged that Iran is aspiring to have. So if Iran escalates, he will use that as evidence to suggest that we cannot trust him with the nuclear bomb. And haven't I always told you that we cannot trust him with the nuclear bomb? And wasn't President Obama so wrong to be trusting in Iranian leadership? And I think that's why, regardless of whether the Iranians back down or not, it will help him in his re-election campaign.
Right, and there's also that concern that when this was not really about nuclear proliferation per se, as President Trump had later on also gone ahead and said in various events publicly, that this was his problem with Iran's presence in proxy wars in the region, which is funny enough because US is as equal to blame in terms of their presence in these same wars. And then at the same time, his concerns for long-range ballistic missiles. Couldn't this conversation have started from scratch instead of sort of leaning on to JCPOA and saying this was wrong to begin with?
Well, I think that would have been possibly President Obama's approach, and I think a more conciliatory US president might have gone down that route. But of course, President Trump always made his mark by already going into a more threatening, more aggressive stance, saying that, we have to show American strength. That's kind of part of his trademark policy. So it isn't likely to be something that he would necessarily use. I think, however, and that's the positive for Iran, if Iran gives him something symbolic that he could claim as a win for him, but isn't so important in substance, that could be a way to de-escalate matters, because he could then go back to his electorate and say, well,
and
look,
what would that thing be symbolically?
It would have to go back to the fear about nuclear proliferation. So it would have to go back to something that he could use to reassure his electorate that he's really doing something. If you look at the situation in North Korea, just meeting up several times was giving him an opportunity to say, look, I'm already going much further than my predecessors.
That's a good example there. Mr. Christian Kaunert, thank you so much for giving us time. Mr. Mostafa, coming back to you, you heard Mr. Christian there. If we are talking about any kind of symbolic gesture which would give President Trump a kind of an opportunity to save face and sort of also show that he's won this round, do you think it's possible that Iran would agree to offer that, like maybe come to the negotiating table with the U.S.?
Well, as a matter of fact, Mr. Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, raised a proposal last week when he was in New York and Washington, and there was not a positive response from the side of the White House. It was something like, within the JCPOA that Iran would initiate ratifying the additional protocol to the NPT that it's doing right now on a voluntary basis. But of course, there is a consensus in Tehran that even this proposal shouldn't have been made, although we all knew that Donald Trump would not go for it. Okay. Because the United States is not just looking for the military nuclear capability. They know if that's the real concern, that they should have stuck to the nuclear deal. The problem here is that they want to contain Iran's power components in various areas of nuclear industry, missile industry, regional power, to make Iran weak and to push Tehran back. Now, this is the game that they are looking for. I mean, these are the goals they are looking for. So Tehran believes that if stands tough against the U.S. for the next few months, then within this engagement strategy that the U.S. has been playing ever since Obama, that relies heavily on sanctions and military threats, this would face a defeat, an ultimate defeat in the next few months. And the pressure, the maximum pressure campaign would lose its efficiency in the next few months. So I don't believe that Tehran now thinks that it should budge, and it's not going to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Koshcheshm, there, analyst, joining us from Tehran. Always kind enough to give us time and share his insight. Now, coming back to you, Mr. Nicolai, something Mr. Mostafa Koshcheshm said is about maximum pressure campaign, something that the UK has never been sort of in agreement to fully and has been opposed to it in the sense that it's not going to work with a country that, though has been bearing sanctions for decades, has not really backed down. The one saving grace was the JCPOA, which they were complying to, according to UN watchdogs, on the sort of nuclear development program they had. So now Jeremy Hunt, the British Foreign Secretary, he's come out and said Tehran's actions on the seizing of the British tanker an act of state and piracy. Do you see maybe Britain stuck in a situation where it will have to toe the US line or the approach to Iran?
Well, again, there are several factors here. I mean, firstly, as I mentioned earlier, Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister at a time when the UK is going to leave the EU, and they are looking desperately for US trade deals. So I think they're going to feel the pressure from Trump to toe the line. I am somewhat surprised that Iran reached out to Boris Johnson the way they did, as I said, trying to recognize that it was May's government rather than his government that seized this tanker. At the same time, there's going to be a lot of pressure. I think also, going back to what my colleague said earlier, he mentioned some interesting points. Firstly, let's not forget the political implications of the nuclear deal and walking away from it. In other words, Trump's belief that Iran has power in the region or has the potential for more regional power. And of course, when Trump mentioned months ago that he may be withdrawing from the Middle East and his military advisors said to him, no, you should not do that. The U.S. concern here is also, if we withdraw, someone else is going to fill that gap. And that gap could be filled by others like, for example, China and Russia, who are also parties to the nuclear deal, who do not want it to fail, and who could set up Iran with their own trade deals. China, for example, is Iran's biggest customer of oil right now, and they are also a nuclear deal signatory. China is a rising power in the region. They want more and more oil. They're turning to the Gulf. The U.S. doesn't like it. And the other point is, I think, also referring back to Obama, I am a bit disturbed as an analyst by looking at a president, in this case President Trump, who is not an international statesman. This is an individual who, he takes to Twitter for diplomacy. He's very aggressive, but also on top of that, withdrawing from a nuclear deal has political repercussions, and there are some who argue that he withdrew from it because he wants to scale back Obama's legacy.
Right.
That to me is very disturbing because, you know, this is you're the president of the United States. This is not your personal fiefdom.
You're referring to UK ambassador to the US leaked cables, David
I'm not talking about Trump here, his actions here. You do not scale back a working nuclear deal to score points back home. I think that's a very dangerous mindset because now you, as a president of the United States, you're on the international stage.
Right.
Act like it.
Okay,
you know.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nicolai, there giving us your insight on this developing situation here. I'd like to welcome another guest, an analyst joining us from Tehran, Mr. Tohid Asadi. Welcome to Newswire. Mr. Tohid, what we're talking about essentially here is, could there be a reconciliation process happening with the help of UK and Iran showing indications? But let me highlight one specific point. What we're seeing here is a conversation also going on where the UK is asking EU for help. And this comes ironically at a time where Brexit is right about to meet its deadline. For a naval mission to protect ships who are trying to navigate the strait. Now, this is something that the US has been advocating for several weeks now, but Iran protests against this. Try and help us understand what are Iran's biggest concerns if this were to happen.
Well, first of all, I would like to tell you that the first point that we need to pay close attention is that Iranian foreign policy has been all the time based upon friendship, reconciliation, and welcoming any kind of talks with any country. But the thing is that when it comes to UK and when it comes to the United States, we see so many negative aspects and so many negative actions that have been taken by these two countries. And the story of oil tankers is not something new, because basically after I can tell you in the last 4 or 5 months, we have seen similar allegations raised by the United Kingdom and United States against Iran.
Mr. Tohid, Mr. Tohid, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're running out of time. So just on that question again, what are Iran's objections to having a sort of internationally placed police system almost in the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I think Iranian side is strongly convinced that these allegations are raised to increase kind of military presence in the region. So it's not a matter of policing the region, but a matter of finding some false accusations to increase military forces in the region. Basically, Iran has been repeatedly said that security of the region is exactly something Tehran wants, and it is precisely for the benefit of the country. So Iran necessarily will not have any objection for further security of the region. But at the same time, we know that. Mm-hmm. We know that, let me move on like this. We are completely aware that such kind of concerns, such kind of accusations that raised are not for the sake of increasing the security of the region, but increasing more.
Let me ask you this, since I'm so sorry to interrupt again, but we're really running out of time here. The reason I ask you this is because the US puts out allegations that Iran is continuing to sell oil and their biggest takers are China. And this is happening right there in the Strait of Hormuz. Could this possibly be a threat of being proven right, which is why Iran has the biggest objection to this kind of policing of the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, Iran has got a very logical right to sell its oil, and then at the same time it has a logical oil to serve its security interests in the region. And then our objection basically is that we are a part of this region, so we would be naturally responsible for its security. But the thing is that when it comes to the United States or the United Kingdom.
Okay, Mr. Tohid there joining us from Tehran. Thank you so much for taking out the time to speak to us about an issue that has continued to escalate between US and Iran. The tensions are high. And now with the new Prime Minister in place in UK, what is going to be the way forward? We will find out and keep you up to date here on Indus News. But that's all the time we have from Newswire. Till next time, goodbye.